everyone, I am Alex from JLMI, and today here with me I have a very special guest, a person that I respect a lot. Please welcome Robert Campbell.
Oh, hello, how are you doing? Hi, Alex, it's great to meet you.
Hello.
Thanks for having me today.
Great to meet you too. Sure, thank you so much for coming. For some of the people in the audience, could you please introduce yourself and maybe quickly explain what kind of work do you do here in Japan?
Okay, great. My name's Robert Campbell. I'm from the United States, grew up in New York City in the Bronx, and I've been living in Japan for about 35 years. I came here as a graduate student to finish up my work in Japanese literature in order to write my Ph.D. dissertation. That was like eons ago. I was in Kyushu for about 11 years teaching Japanese literature at the university that I was studying at as my sort of entry-level job. And then I came to Then I came to Tokyo in 1995 to become an associate professor at the National Institute of Japanese Literature, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an archive and a literary research center which promotes all kinds of studies in literature and the sharing of the legacy of pre-modern Japanese literature in Tokyo. And then from there, I went on to become an associate and then a full professor at the University of Tokyo. And 4.5 years ago, I became the director of the National Institute of Japanese Literature, which I was very, very proud to be able to lead for 4 years. My term ended in March. So now I'm a university professor at Waseda University, which is just north of the Imperial Palace in the center of Tokyo. We'll be talking a little bit more about this today, I believe, but the Waseda University is just about to open up the Waseda International House of Literature, which houses the author Haruki Murakami's library, which he donated to us a couple of years ago, and I'm involved in that as well. So that's a short story in long words, Alex, I'm afraid, but that should give you a sort of a profile of my tracks over the last couple of decades.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm very tempted to skip right to the Murakami question, but before we move there, there is another question that I'm sure everyone asks you, as in, how did you get into the Japanese literature? But I did my research, so I know that it always started with the tale of Genji, as it does for a lot of people, I suppose. So who is your favorite character in the tale of Genji?
Wow, that's a quick sort of silver bullet to my heart there. I have never been asked that before, outside of izakaya, sort of talking about Genji and things like that in the evening. I used to. The first first edition I read of Genji, I was a freshman in college at the University of California in Berkeley, and Edward Seidensticker's translation had just come out when I was in high school, and it came out in paperback when I was like a freshman in college, so I was able to buy it. Because one of the first classes that I took, I'm like slipping into the first question that you're not asking me, by the way, but I'm going to try not to go too far into that. But I took a course in comparative literature when I was a freshman, and the instructor, who was a really young associate professor, he was European, he said the oldest novel in the world was written in the 11th century in Japan. It was called The Tale of Genji, and it's the first time I'd ever heard of that. So I wasn't really interested in Japanese literature, or that I didn't know anything about The Tale of Genji, but I went to the bookstore, and this paperback edition, really, really thick. It was like sort of like this, like 1,000 pages, less than 1,000 pages. But anyway, I bought it. And the first thing that I really, really was like intrigued by was this character, this luminous character, Genji, who is very, very young, and it goes through his life, passes through his death, and then the next generation of his children's next generation, through this very, very long sort of historical saga of noble Japanese Kyoto in the 11th century. And it was fascinating to me to sort of follow through and see the world through Genji's eyes. And especially he's a very amorous man. So he he discovers and is introduced to and just passes by and becomes sort of enamored of lots of women in the story. And some of the women, the way that he encounters them was really, really fascinating to me. You don't see it in like 18th century or 19th century realistic Western novels. So the first sort of really sort of like romantic concern for Genji that I encountered and I really, really liked and I was like really, really interested was Lady Murasaki, whom he sort of discovers. She's around 14 years old and he's really, really young also. And he has malaria. He has an infective disease and he goes off into the hills north of Kyoto to have prayers. We're talking about the 11th century, so they don't have antibiotics or anything like that. So he was going off to have this monk pray for him so that he recover. And he just walks by this house and there's this hedge and he peeks through the hedge, which is like completely like illegal now. But anyway, he sort of peeks through the hedge and we call that kaimamiru in Japanese, which means peeking through the hedge. And it's a word that people use in modern Japanese today, which means to sort of look into something, catch a glance at something. It actually comes from this scene in the Tale of Genji. If anyone who's interested in Japanese etymology will be thrilled to know this, I'm sure. But anyway, he opens up this hedge and he sees this girl playing with her chaperones and the people who are taking care of her. And she's just really, really beautiful. She reminds him of his mother, sort of. And anyway, she's very, very noble, it turns out. And he becomes her guardian. And he raises her and falls in love with her. And from a certain point, they have a relationship and she becomes the love of his life, basically. So the sort of elan or the sort of trajectory of her life to me in that story. I don't want to spoil the story for anybody, but the way that her life sort of unfolds, it's interesting, not trying to worrying about spoilers from an 11th century Japanese novel. But anyway, I'm not going to tell you what happens between them and what happens with her through the novel. But anyway, the course of her life was really, really fascinating to me. But more recently, I'm more kind of intrigued by the side stories. For example, in Genji, there's one of his really, really close friends, an older cousin of his. His name is Tono Chujo. It might be translated as like Lieutenant Chujo or something like that. I'm not sure how it's translated, but he's a sort of sidekick and of Genji's, and he goes along. He's a little lower than him in rank, but he has a lot of freedom to move because Genji is very, very high in rank, and he has all of these sort of restraints because of his position in court and so forth. So his cousin and his friend Tono Chujo sort of teaches him a lot of things. You know, when he's a teenager and he's older, and then Genji is sort of he's exiled from the castle. Genji is exiled from the capital at one point, and he goes off to this very, very sort of forlorn sort of beach, which is not really that far from Kyoto, but in the 11th century was really, really far away. So he's exiled there. And Tono Chujo is like the only friend of his who saw him off and was actually sort of stuck by his side and sort of supported him and things like that. And he's just really, really kind of an interesting character. When I was like 20 years old or 19 years old, he didn't stick in my head or my heart or anything like that. But more recently, it's just kind of like interesting. Also, he's like really, really close, and he takes care of Genji's son and the relationship between his friend's son and himself. And he tries to sort of guide him through life. He's kind of like a mentor to him. And as I've gotten older myself, I feel more sort of empathy with that sort of character. Anyway, short lecture on the Tale of Genji and the characters that I like.
That was wonderful. It's too bad we do not have enough time to discuss every character, because it's not that often that you actually meet people, even Japanese people, who are capable of speaking about Genji characters for so long. But thank you so much. So I suppose, do you recommend for anyone who's interested in Japanese literature, but maybe didn't have really the courage to tackle the Tale of Genji yet, would you definitely recommend to read it?
Yeah, Genji is really, really good. There are a number of translations out. When I was a kid, when I first encountered it, there was really only Edward Seidensticker's translation. Before that, we had Arthur Waley, which was translated before the war, and it's really, really rough, very literary. He's a Bloomsbury British, great literary figure, Arthur Waley, a friend of Virginia Woolf's. His English is wonderful, but it's an adaptation. It's not an accurate translation. So I would recommend any translation that's been done since Edward Seidensticker's in the 1970s. And each of them are very, very different, but the story is really, really good. And it really reads like a novel. And I really appreciate my assistant professor instructor when I was a freshman in college, because he just sort of like threw this word out, and it really kind of stuck in my head. And I really enjoyed it. But if you're going to read The Tale of Genji, it's really, really long. So you need like a weekend or maybe like 3 or 4 days on the beach, maybe to really immerse yourself in it, to read it. So I would also at the same time recommend stories like The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon, which is an essay by a contemporary woman writer of Murasaki Shikibu, who is also a woman writer who wrote The Tale of Genji. But it's an essay about the things that she likes and dislikes, and it gives you a really, 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 really interesting sort of cut into sort of Japanese culture and the way that Japanese people look at the world, judge historical and natural phenomena, how they deal with each other. This woman, Sei Shonagon, the author, has a very, very short temper, and she gets like really, really irritated and sort of angry about things, and it's just very, very refreshing. It's very, very honest, and I think it's kind of like might be a sort of surprise to some readers to cut through all of the sort of fog. And the things that we often think of as being ambiguous about Japanese literature and culture and things like that. She's very, very direct, right on the point. And that would be something that's good also. But there are also lots of other stories and tales, and a lot of really, really good poetry from the Heian period, from the 9th century up until the beginning of the 12th century in Japan. So just, do some searches. I mean, there's a lot of good translation out there, and some of it you can get online as well.
Yeah, so we do encourage everyone who is listening to us to do some research into that. And I personally love Heian literature, and I love the illustrations as well.
Right.
Their outfits, they're so wonderful. But I suppose I would also have to ask you whether modern Japanese literature was popular when you were just starting to discover what Japanese literature is.
Yeah, this was in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, and Japan was becoming an economic animal. Everything was, a lot of people in the United States. I was on the West Coast, so I think my generation, people who were sort of looking around the world at that point, sort of noticed what was going on in Japan a little bit sooner than people in Europe, perhaps. Perhaps on the East Coast of the United States as well, just because it's on the Pacific, and there was always a large influence from Asia there as well. But no, music was really popular when I was in high school. Japanese modern music, Japanese modern architecture, and literature also was getting translated. A lot of modern literature was translated, of course, after the war. Translated simultaneously as it was being written. Kawabata Yasunari won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 1960s, and his contemporaries, people who are younger than him, like Yukio Mishima, people younger than him, like Kenzaburo Oe, who won the Nobel Prize more recently, were being translated a lot. And so it was like reading modern, contemporary, up-to-date English literature for me, in a sense. So yeah, I was reading a lot of stuff, first of all, in literature. I was reading a lot of stuff, first of all, in translation.
I see. So if you would have to choose between Kawabata Mishima and Oe, who is your top number one?
Okay, this has changed a lot over the years. I would have said Mishima when I was like 21 or 22, the first time I came to Japan. He was one of the first writers. Forbidden Colors, for example, Confessions of a Mask. His early novels, I really were some of the first full-length books that I read in Japanese. You know, I'd go into like a coffee shop and drink iced coffee in the afternoon and spend about 2.5 hours like looking through the dictionary, sort of investigating kanji that I couldn't read while I was trying to get through Confessions of a Mask. And it was all really, really interesting. I have really good memories of that. But and I also liked Kenza Oe's novels a lot when I was young. Read them in the original mostly. But I really like Kawabata Yasunari now more. It's quieter, the sort of reverberations, the way that he doesn't say everything. Everything isn't out on the deck. It's sort of also, I've been reading Kawabata over the last maybe 2 years during COVID, for example, and not just because of COVID, but maybe it's because of my stage in life or something like that. I appreciate literature. This is true for music also, and for painting and illustration, stuff like that, that has like, that leaves something up to the imagination. It leaves something, it sort of challenges you to fill in the spaces in a way. And neither Mishima nor Oe are writers like that, especially Mishima. He's very, very almost architectural in the way that he sets up everything, very, very logical. There are a lot of really, typically Japanese aspects, of course, to what he writes. He's a Japanese writer. He grew up during the war, but he's also very, very strongly influenced by 19th century and early 20th century Western realistic writers and philosophers. And so forth. And especially his later works are really, really very, very dense, very, very logical, really, really well constructed, but they don't move my heart in the way that they used to.
Yeah, I remember that when I read Kawabata for the first time, it was so different from a Western novel. And I think it was Beauty and Sadness, and it was the last page, and I was like, is this the last page, really? How is this possible? Wow, of course, with Mishima, there is more, it's easier to recognize the form of the
Alex, I think that's a really good word that you said at the end. It's easier to recognize. I mean, that's not a judgment, about the value of it, I don't think, but you can see yourself, one's own experiences as a reader, more clearly, I think, in Mishima and all of his work than you do in something like, for example, Sound of the Mountain, for example, by Kawabata Yasunari. You really can't, like you said, the last page. Again, I don't want to give out any spoilers, but you've gotten really involved with this sort of family, this young family, this man who lives in Kamakura in the hills. It's really, really beautiful, but like at the end, there isn't much sort of meat at the end. You don't know you don't know what you've ingested at the end of the story. But hopefully it leaves you somehow with the same sort of feeling that you feel after seeing a really, really good movie, perhaps, or a live concert or something like that. There's this sort of, you feel sort of encouraged, sad perhaps, and you kind of think about the characters and the scenes and the words that he's used. So I don't know, somehow there's almost like poetry in a way. It's like not so much the narration itself, but what's been sort of described and what it leaves you with is something that I really enjoy.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And actually, as long as we did venture into this area of literature, I guess comparative literature you would call it, I don't know whether you read Western literature now, but if you do you feel some kind of disconnect from it just because you've been so, so involved with Japanese literature? Do you feel weird when you're reading Western narratives?
Right. Yeah. I don't feel weird. I mean, I feel like reading, I read a lot of like 19th century, early 20th century English language literature, more stuff that written by writers who are not from Britain or the United States or Canada, who write in English but are from all over the world. More recently, translated stuff as well from Latin America, and I don't really feel that there's like a real sort of just sort of break or anything like that. But yeah, there are things that I noticed, explanations. Things are much more specific about tense, about how many people are there, about gender, For example, you're reading a Japanese novel and you can get to the third or fourth page before you know if there's like one person or the scene in the scene or three or four people in the scene. And Japanese writers, especially young writers like Mariko Asabuki, for example, who's one of my favorite young writers, are really, really adept at using the Japanese language to create a sort of almost sort of fantastical, sort of magical, realistic sort of sense of being floating in time. You can't really tell. For example, Asabuki's novels, often you can't really tell whether you're in the present or you're in 200 or 300 years before that. Often her characters merge, and there's a sort of like merging of subjectivity, so that you can't really tell who's the narrator, and she knows that, and she uses that to really, really great effect. And that's something that of course can be done in English literature as well, in the English language as well. But somehow there's something about the Japanese language and Japanese literature as well that is really sort of allows subjectivity and tense and situation to sort of meld or to sort of blend into each other. And you don't have this like logos, sort of rational, sort of the world. This is the world. It's been created. We all have our own individual, sort of identity, and you can't go beyond that. And I do feel that when I read, when I read 19th century, early 20th century, for example, British novels, George Eliot, Jane Austen, whatever, it's so, the world is so secure there. Everything is there. So they know what's going on. There's no sort of ambiguity or tension about how people present themselves and the way that the world is seen. But when I read more recent work, it's kind of like, wow, I mean, why is this person so involved and invested in proving that she is herself, or she is an individual person? I mean, come on, individuality and character and all of those things are really, really important. It's especially important for people in minority populations, people who have to struggle to live and for their rights, to know what they are and to see the boundaries that separate them from the majority and things like that. So that's really, really important. But on the other hand, once you get used to reading Japanese literature, and this is probably like perhaps a negative aspect also, you kind of like, it allows you to sort of forget or to be able to pass over into other people's points of view in a way that's not entirely responsible. It may be sort of irresponsible in some ways, but it feels really good. And it really kind of tracks, I think, our reality, especially if we spend a lot of time online, if you're doing a lot in video media, or conversing with people that you've never really met, going through different sort of layers in order to communicate with people through different languages and so forth. There's something about like Japanese literature that clicks, I think, to the modern sort of reader in a way that maybe people wouldn't have felt 20 years ago or 30 years ago. What do you think about that, Alex?
Yes, actually, I completely agree with you. And personally, I really appreciate that in Japanese literature. And probably at least one of my favorite ever short stories written is by Akutagawa, and it's In the Bamboo Grove. So I think that it's just so interesting how you get those different perspectives, right, on a completely same accident, but then just different people perceive it differently, right? And then reality becomes very flexible. And yeah, I think it is actually very relevant to the modern times, because I've noticed that recently we're getting all these, TV dramas where we actually see things from different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that seems like a legacy of Akutagawa in some way, although I'm sure that, no one in Netflix, read Akutagawa and thought.
You can't be sure about that. You can't be sure about that, but maybe, yeah. No, that's possible. No, there's in narratology, the study of how narratives are built and how to analyze them and so forth. There's actually a term, we don't use it too much in English, but it's very, very common in Japanese literary studies, which is called the bamboo thicket narrative. I mean, it's like it's a way that, you know, that's narrative from different perspectives. You don't have a reliable one singular, you know, sort of narrator who's going to present the whole world to you. You see, one is forced to sort of judge and to juggle between slightly different realities, depending on the point of view of the person, and that comes really natural in a way to I think to Japanese writers. When we write in Japanese, it's easy to just sort of like skip over, you know, one's own sort of social sort of identity in a way, which is kind of interesting.
Yes. Okay. Well, I would love to talk about this for another 2 hours, but just kind of on a related topic, though, I feel like Murakami is a person who very much, unified Western storytelling and Japanese storytelling. Well, at least this is how he's positioned in the world, right? And of course, because you are the advisor for the Haruki Murakami Library, I would love to hear what you think about Murakami, about his books, and if you want to tell us a bit more about the library itself, that would be great.
Right, thanks a lot. Yeah, the library itself is kind of based around Haruki Murakami's, you know, his work, his life, and what he's still as an active writer and public intellectual, what he's aiming at, and he's changed obviously over the decades. But he donated his extensive library of books and manuscripts and scrap albums, and very importantly, his incredible collection of vinyl. He's a record collector. He started a coffee shop with his wife Yoko, whom he met as a student at Waseda University, and they started this shop while he was a student. So he was a sort of like a student, you know, venture capitalist when he was really, really young, and he would always like play records, especially jazz records, while serving the guests and things like that. And for anybody who's read Murakami's work, you know that music is really, really important in his work. He uses it very, very effectively. And anyway, he has this incredible collection of over 10,000 record albums, which he's donated to us. So the library itself is built around the sort of the limbs of his different sort of activities. There's an audio room with a really, really good record player where people can come and, ask to see his records. All of them have linings and things like that, so you can actually see the physical objects, play them and listen to them, and perhaps use them in your research, or just to listen to them, or to conduct workshops, study groups, while listening to the music that's actually appearing in his novels and things like that. We also have a radio studio. He really likes radio a lot. So we built a radio studio, which is capable of actually producing and broadcasting radio there as well. And there's also an incredible, wonderful sort of staircase with a sort of tunnel, a sort of a wooden tunnel all the way around it, with bookshelves going all the way up to the ceiling. It's like maybe 10 meters high. This is all designed by the prominent Japanese modern architect, Kengo Kuma, who's also a friend of Murakami's. And the books, a lot of his books are just out on the shelves, so you can just pick them up. Anyone who comes to the library can just pick them up. One of the things that he really wanted to stress in making this donation and helping us create this library was that it be accessible to everyone, and that you don't have to be a Murakami fan. He says that he wants people to come there who really don't know his work at all, and who perhaps don't even like his novels, but a lot of the books are not just everything that he's written and all of the translations throughout the world. You can see everything that's been translated in every language there, but all of the books that he's been collecting himself and reading in all kinds of different areas. So it's kind of like a sort of nexus, or a sort of time capsule of a world literature, star who has been collecting books since the 1970s and 1980s. And we're going to use that to open up different stories, and to get people together, and to be able to talk about, and to converse, and to cross over different linguistic and religious and national barriers, hopefully. So anyway, that's what the library is about. My office is there. I'm a latecomer to Murakami's works. I started reading in real time from around Kafka on the Shore, so it's the beginning of the century, I guess maybe about 20 years ago. Went back from there, obviously, to read Norwegian Wood, the earlier stories as well. But I really like his more recent work as well. He's a great short story writer, and he's also a really, really good translator of American and English, but especially American literature into Japanese. That's something that most readers abroad don't really have access to, because you have to be able to read Japanese in order to read Murakami's translation of Raymond Chandler into Japanese, to feel the difference and to feel Murakami's writing as a translator. While he's translating someone else's work, you need to be able to read Japanese for that. So that's one good goal, I think, for people who are interested in studying Japanese. But I've been reading his translations recently as well, and that's really fascinating to see, as you said, Alex, how one writer has been able to sort of cross over or to combine different aspects of Western language and Western culture into a very, very sort of Japanese sort of milieu or context as well. And one of the ways he's done that is by translating himself. He's a very, very productive sort of translator into Japanese as well. But anyway, I really like those novels. I really, of course, at real time, I lined up to buy my first copy of 1984, Killing Commendatore, which came out in 1917 as well, and one more recent works as well.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that, these days we have this literature that really wouldn't be able to exist without either Japanese literature or Western literature. So Murakami would never be Murakami unless he read American authors and Japanese authors, right? And in that regard, I guess I'd like to ask you whether you're familiar with Mizumura Minae, who is also kind of a writer who works on this verge of different cultures and different languages as well. So if our audience has not heard of her, she is a bilingual author. And she's experimenting with a kind of mix in different languages. So if you have read her, what did you think about her?
Yeah, I really respect her, and I enjoy her novels, and also her sort of her opinion pieces that she's written, and the books that she's written about the state of the Japanese language. She wrote one book, which I'm not sure whether it's been translated or not, which is called The Destruction of Japanese Language Going Down the Drain. I don't know that's how that could be translated. That's right. But she also wrote a second volume of that as well, which was a sort of like wake-up call to not just people who were Japanese readers in order to sort of defend the Japanese language and the legacy of Japanese culture through Japanese language in the face of the, sort of universal onslaught from English from the late 20th century and into our century right now. But it's also really, really, she also has a very, very sharp critical eye on the dynamics and the power relationships between English and so-called minor languages like Japanese. And that really sort of segues into her work as a novelist as well, really, really well. She's, as you said, she does a lot of experimental work. She's done wonderful work finishing up novels which were written by Japanese writers in the early 20th century, which is really, really fascinating. She has a very, very sharp sense of sort of Black humor, very cynical in a way, which you would notice right away if you've listened to any of her talks. I happen to know her personally, and she has a very, very wicked, warm sense of humor. But no, she's I think a very, very important writer who not only spans, two very, very sort of different cultures and languages, but has a very, very unique point of view and way of analyzing both. So yeah, I think that her work is very, very important. When you mentioned Minae Mizumura to me in this context, I recall the work of Yoko Tawada as well, who's a really, really important poet and novelist and essayist, Japanese woman who has lived in Germany about the same number of years that I've lived in Japan. She writes in Japanese, but she also writes in German. She's also very, very highly appreciated and recognized, and has won a lot of awards for her works written in German, as well as the works that she's written in Japanese. She's really, really fascinating writer, thinker, and she plays with the Japanese language. When she writes in Japanese, she notices things and makes a lot of sort of word play using onomatopoeia, using the sort of ambiguity of Japanese kanji, for example. When she writes in Japanese, she'll sort of deconstruct a kanji in ways that Japanese writers like myself who live in Japan just really don't really notice and wouldn't think of, because it's like air to us kind of when we're writing or thinking about it in Japanese. But she has this wonderful way of sort of noticing things about the language and about the culture, which really, really really go deep, I think, into more sort of universal problems about loneliness and about living and about love and the way that we think about death. And a lot of the stuff that really strong novelists really deal with. She uses language sort of as a way to delve into that and to discover. So I think that those two writers, Mizumura and Tawada, right now are among the strongest in their generation of writers, or any active Japanese novelists right now, especially because of their particular positions that they've created for themselves, sort of, going over or between two different cultures.
Yeah, I think I would highly recommend those to our audience, especially people who maybe already live in Japan and they are familiar with that kind of feeling when you're in a different country and then you see things completely differently. And then the linguistic layer, it's just also kind of, becomes this floating level of how do you see things? How do you even name things? You have to reconstruct the world for yourself. So yes, and in that regard, speaking about these bilingual writers, and do you think this is where Japanese literature is heading? Because the recent Akutagawa Prize as well was given to a non-native writer, so I think that is a remarkable event really in the history of Japanese literature. What do you think?
That's right. Yeah, a lot of men and women who haven't been brought up here or aren't Japanese by nationality or heritage are writing a lot of really good work in fiction, poetry, essays, political opinion, all kinds of sort of discourse now is being put out and being sort of appreciated and influencing Japanese discourse itself, not just because they're foreign, but because, or the perspective that a foreigner brings, but just because of the quality of the work itself, which is something that we see more and more recently over the last perhaps decade or two. There are other writers, English language writers, Chinese language writers who came before Lee Kotomi, who is the woman you just mentioned, who just won the most prestigious award a few weeks ago here in Japan, the Akutagawa Show. Yeah, no, she's a really, really good writer, and she's fascinating. She's also very, very challenging in a way to the older generations of Japanese readers, perhaps because often her protagonists are sexual minorities. The relationships between people in the stories, for example, one of her earliest stories has two women who are in love with each other, two foreign students who come to Japan and form a relationship. And there's a lot of drama that evolves from that. And that's not something, I mean, that's something, sort of lesbian fiction is something that we have in Japan, we've had for a long time. But you don't see that sort of combined with sort of a foreigner coming and writing a novel about it, which sort of overlooks that and doesn't really sort of turn that into a theme itself. And the fact that she's won the award this time is, I think, encouraging, I think, and especially for younger Japanese writers who don't have this sort of feeling of, of what, sort of standards and what society and what people, what a novelist is supposed to look like, or what a novel, or what the characters in a novel are supposed to be doing, and things like that. I think it reflects more the sort of younger generations, what their sensibilities are as well. So anyway, she's a really, really good writer. We're going to be welcoming her, by the way, at one of the opening events at the Murakami Library at the beginning of April. In fact, we invited her to come as a speaker before she was nominated to the Akutagawa Prize as well. So fortunately, I'm going to be able to meet her in a couple of months. But no, she's a really, really good, strong young writer. There are other Chinese language writers, like, for example, yes, Yi Yang, for example, American writers like Ian Hideo Levy as well, who's been writing fiction for the last few decades as well. So I think that a lot of people who acquire Japanese as a language, and the fiction that they write or the poetry that they write, it can be political opinion pieces, it can be in economics, whatever. The communications, the way that they have to communicate and what they have to offer is very, very important. And I think that that's a good thing to keep in mind as a goal for Japanese learners, for people who are committed and want to express themselves and create ripples of their own in Japanese society, to know that it's accessible. And that you can not just read and use the words that you read to create your own value and to work and to live among Japanese people, or to live among Japanese speakers, but you can also sort of throw your own, sort of stones onto the lake and see the ripples that it makes in Japanese. That's a Japanese metaphor, I'm afraid, that I just used, but no, I think it's really, really encouraging. And I think that that's something that's coming on. It's not going to take over, the entirety of the Japanese literary scene. But yeah, I think young writers, or not young writers, who are coming from different backgrounds are really important and really, really good part of what's going on here today.
Well, that is extremely encouraging to hear. And I'm glad that, there are different people, and some of them might still be students, and also people like you who are already, established academics, that everyone is very open to this kind of literature emerging. So I think we have learned something very, very inspiring today. And yeah, I'm so satisfied with everything that you said right now. But I guess I would love to move to something that would make you feel happy, which is Edo literature.
Okay, great.
And yeah, I'm sure that as much as you love old literature, Edo is your favorite because that is your area of expertise. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, the Edo period, well, the long 19th century, we often say in English, fits really, really well with Japanese literary history and with Japanese history itself. The 19th century covers the so-called sakoku, or sort of secluded period when Japan was closed off to most of the world, but it also covers the years of turbulence which led up to the Meiji Restoration in 1868. And about a decade before that, Japanese actually opened up to the West, and the opening up and the development of modern capitalism and the involvement of Japan as a nation state in the rest of the world in the 19th century, that all occurred in the course of about 100 years. So my specialty is Edo period, but also early Meiji period, early modern Japan, you might want to say, and the sort of the differences, but also the continuity that you see in fiction and poetry, non-fictional writing as well. Also sort of literary social events, literary history is something that I'm really interested in as well in that period. So yeah, that's something that's more and more studied recently, and a lot of really good translations have come out recently as well. But it's kind of a late bloomer in the West, I think, for areas of Japanese culture for people to have access to.
Right. So could you elaborate maybe on why? I've read somewhere that you mentioned that Edo language especially is just very precious to you personally, and that you really enjoy reading it and translating it. Could you maybe elaborate on that?
Right, sure. One of I started out reading, as I mentioned before, Yukio Mishima, Kawabata's work. I really like Tanizaki, Junichiro Tanizaki's novels a lot. And so I kind of like tooled myself, sort of trained myself to be able to read modern writers in Japanese, sort of as deeply as I could. And that's sort of one way that I really got, I sort of like attached myself to the language by trying to get through these short stories and novels and things like that. And then I got to a point where I was reading like Natsume Soseki. And I realized that Natsume Soseki was born in the last year of the Edo period, right before the Meiji Restoration. And he grew up in Tokyo, which had just become renamed or rebranded as modern Tokyo in 1868 during the modern period. But all of his parents and his grandparents and all of the work that you see that he writes when he was really, really young makes it obvious that he's like really an Edo person. I mean, he's like, just because the regime changed and the name of the city that you grew up in changed doesn't mean that everything, like your heart and all of the ways that you see the world didn't really change that much for the first or the second or the third generation of modern Japanese writers. So I was like I was reading I Am a Cat, which was his first novel, and some of it is like really, really funny. It's like a really humorous, long, eventually sad story, but a lot of it is like Japanese storytelling, traditional Japanese storytelling, comical storytelling, which we call rakugo in Japanese. And I got interested in what he was reading when he was a kid, what the sources of his sort of humor and stuff were. And I that kind of like threw me back sort of, and I just kind of took the further I went back, the more I realized that, wait a minute, there's this incredible divide between Natsume Soseki and the modern writers and what they were reading when they were kids. Wait a minute, we can't read this. I mean, it's like a completely different, the diction is different, the rhythm is different, the orthography, the way that it's actually, if you look at the original texts themselves, the way that it's written, it's like all really, really different. And I saw that this is like this enormous sort of river between modern Japanese society and culture and literature and what was going on just maybe 10 or 20 years before that, over the course of 260 years, which is how long the Edo period was. So I just got like kind of intrigued by that. And I started reading stuff from the 1830s and the 1840s. Maybe that's what Soseki was read to when he was a kid on his grandmother's lap, maybe. She was like reading him stories and things like that. And it just got really interesting to me because, Alex, as you said, the prose is just very, very different. If you read it aloud, you can tell, even if you can't speak Japanese, you can tell that it has a rhythm. Japanese prose before the modern period has a sort of like a written standard. Written Japanese is very, very different from spoken Japanese, and it's almost sort of melodic. It goes in these very, very sort of, it sounds like you're reading a song that somebody wrote. I mean, it doesn't rhyme like in English, but it has a sort of prosody or a sort of rhythm that it falls, and you can really tell that. And to me, reading that aloud, like 17th century or 18th century prose, Japanese prose, it felt like listening to jazz. It felt like Ella Fitzgerald going off on a riff, like Ella Fitzgerald singing with Louis Armstrong in Berlin in 1956 at a nightclub, and then suddenly like flying off, and starting to sing, not using words, but just using her own sort of song, her own words, but in a rhythm sort of a way. And there's a lot of Japanese prose that I still think feels like, improvisational jazz to me, because it's really, really free and it's really, really powerful, but it has a structure in a way. And it's something that, although modern Japanese writers they're really, really strong, brilliant stylists who are very conscious of the way the way that language can be used to convey things to people, we don't have as many tools in modern Japanese as classical writers had. Literacy, I think, for everyone in the Edo period wasn't able to read. This is true in the West also. Literacy was less common. Although literacy was very, very high in Japan in the 18th century and the 19th century, I think people who read had expectations of writers to throw different things at them that maybe they weren't able to read right away, which were more sort of difficult. So there are a lot of allusions to older texts. It's very, very rhetorical, very, very decorative or sort of baroque sometimes. And as I said, but for me anyway, being in my early 20s when I was sort of discovering classical 19th century Japanese literature through modern literature, it just amazed me at how it sounded. Just the rhythm of it was just really, really kind of like sexy to me anyway. I don't know how to, I can't think of a better word to say, but it just sounded, just was very, very sort of sensuous and sensual sort of at the same time.
Yeah, I think there's no better way to put it, honestly. I don't know. I'm assuming you have to have an extremely high level of Japanese to be able to understand everything, but would you encourage our listeners to try and read some of Edo period literature?
Absolutely. Because there are like 2 or 3 advantages that we have as non-native people who haven't been educated in Japan in regard to classical Japanese language. One is modern Japanese people can't read it either. It's like there's this divide. Right. There's this divide between modern Japanese that people write and read and can hear and can speak, and what was going on 150 years ago. We can't even imagine that as English or French or Russian or German speakers, because if you're Russian or you're German or you're French, you can read something that was written in the 19th century. You can read it on the subway. You can read it standing up while you're waiting for a bus. You don't need a dictionary, okay? You don't need commentaries to read it. But if you're Japanese, unless you spent a lot of your life, really committed to reading older literature, you have to have commentary or you have to have some explanation to navigate, because the diction has changed, the grammar has changed. It's almost in some ways, it's like a different language. So anyway, it's like coming, if you're going to go into this different area of language, it's kind of nice to know that you don't have this comparative disadvantage to everybody else who's around you. Okay. So that's something I've really, really felt as a researcher in pre-modern Japanese literature. People who I can really communicate with about a particular text are really, really limited. I mean, that's not in itself a good thing, but I think it's really accessible. There isn't much of a barrier there. It doesn't matter whether you're Japanese or American or Argentinian or Israeli or whatever. I mean, you have to really put some effort into reading it, whoever you are. So it's interesting to be able to talk to Japanese people around you while you're learning it, because maybe the people who are learning it with you, they're also struggling with it. Maybe they're interested in different ways. So it's kind of like a common task in a way. That's one thing. Another good reason for people who are not native speakers to study pre-modern Japanese literature is that, this is true in English and other languages as well, it gives you a really, really deep knowledge of modern Japanese itself. You get to know where all of these sayings come from, where all of the etymology of different words are. It just makes you a stronger, it makes your expressions and the way you communicate yourself and the ideas that you have when you're speaking in Japanese, it makes them stronger and richer. I think this is true in any language, right? To be able to read from generations before what we're living right now. I think that's something that's really important. The third thing and the final thing is that there are a lot of really, really, really good tools out now to help people read pre-modern Japanese literature. Pre-modern Japanese literature or language has a lot of different styles. Some of it is very, very sinological. It's close to classical Japanese. It's close to classical Chinese. Some of it is very, very vernacular and sort of vulgar, and it kind of imitates street talk in the 18th century and the 19th century in Japan. So these really, really high level and low level and different ways that people express themselves. And there are dictionaries now, not just dictionaries, there are apps, for example, to help you read and get through the basics of Japanese classical literature. I really want to recommend to anyone who's interested in studying pre-modern Japanese language to also at the same time begin to learn how to read the script also. The script is cursive, it's very, very different. Most modern Japanese people can't read it, but if you want to really sort of discover a new world, what people in the Japanese archipelago were feeling and thinking, how nature has changed, how the environment has changed, what's gone on over the incredibly documented, richly documented 1,000-year sort of period of experience in Japan. It's really, really important that you're able to have access to the original documents themselves. And Japanese language has been written down using a brush and paper and ink. And it's written not in block letters, it's written in cursive words and letters, which most Japanese people today don't know. Hopefully you'll have an insert at the bottom of this image here to give an example of our viewers today of what I'm talking about. But it's fascinating. If you go into a soba noodle shop, or if you get a package of Japanese sweets, often the paper will have beautiful cursive writing on it, which most people can't read. It's looked at as a sort of decoration or an ornament, but there'll be an incredible poem written on it, or really, really wonderful words of wisdom. So there are apps. There are 2 or 3 apps right now that you can download for free which show you how to begin to read Japanese hiragana or orthographic scripts as well. So you don't have to wait until you're like a really good Japanese speaker. You don't have to be like fluent entirely in Japanese before you study modern Japanese literature, because it's a very, very different enterprise. And that was true for me also. I started studying it when I was about 20 or so. And it was like a 2-track sort of system to me. I was studying modern Japanese while I was studying classical literature as well in college.
Well, I'm sure that is encouraging for some of our viewers who would be doubting whether they can even try to approach it at all, or maybe they should wait a little bit. And I'm sure that also some of them are thinking of maybe studying at the university. So what kind of period would you recommend to study or specialize in? Is there anything that you personally, well, I'm sure that, if it's late Edo and early Meiji, you have a personal attachment to that period, but is there some kind of understudied period that really needs researchers?
Right. Alex, I would say that there isn't a period which needs more research. I would sort of rephrase that perhaps, or sort of try to answer your question by saying there are periods that are more richly documented than other periods. We're talking about, I said 1,000 years, but Japanese literature actually spans about 1,300 years. And the further you go back, obviously, the fewer original documents sort of remain as classical. The canon of Japanese literature was created from the late medieval period, perhaps from the 15th century through the 16th century. In the Edo period, you have a lot of scholars who are writing commentaries about the tale of Genji, for example. So you have like a canon, a list of works which are the Japanese, sort of classics already when you come into the modern period. But the further you go down, the closer you get to the modern period, the more work actually survives physically. So if you're somebody that's really, really interested in digging into original documents and sort of digging out and deciphering and discovering materials that you're going to evaluate and you're going to discover the interest and the importance of, and introduce those documents together with a sort of theoretical way to analyze them, then I think later periods are better. The Edo period from the 18th century up until the 19th century are really good because there are mountains of undeciphered, unread books which are out there waiting for you. You can take a look at the image database which we've made, which we're still in the course of making at the National Institute of Japanese Literature. It's free, it's open, obviously, 24 hours a day, all day long. And there are over perhaps maybe 17,000 there are more than, just a second, there are more than like 100,000 titles of Japanese texts, original Japanese texts up there right now. So please, if you have a chance, Google search National Institute of Japanese Literature, you'll find an image database there. And if you can put in, we're not so strong yet with English language, but if you can put something in Japanese, you'll be able to come up with all kinds of, it's all kinds of images, and texts themselves are tagged. So if you're interested in dogs, if you're interested in rabbits, if you're interested in eggs, whatever, you can just put those words in and a lot of text, and the original text will come up as well. So the digitization of Japanese text is stronger for the later periods, right? Because there's more of it there. So that's one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it might be, okay, I'm interested in studying about women's writing, for example, in Japanese literature, okay? If you're interested in how women were looking at the world, seeing the world, situating themselves, dealing with society around them, recording their experiences, women's readership, for example. One period to look into would be the medieval period, for example. A lot of Japanese women who were nuns, Buddhist religious people, were avid writers. They wrote travel logs, poetry, a lot of really interesting literature, and a lot of good research has come out in recent years about women writers in the medieval eras. Of course, the Heian period from the 9th century up until the 12th century is full of really, really strong, wonderful, important world class women writers as well. You get into the Edo period and you find women writers are less researched, or the subjectivity or the experience of women as a topic for research is less explored. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of work to be done in the Edo period as well. So if you're interested in a particular theme or a particular theory, I have no period or genre that I would recommend, but there are certain areas that have a lot of sort of possibilities and sort of work to be done as well. But if you're interested in like the materials themselves and learning how to sort of create your own field of work by using original materials, I think it's probably a better idea to look into the later centuries themselves. Anyway, I hope that's useful advice.
I think that was very practical advice that I'm hoping people will be able to use in their careers. And as long as we are talking about careers, do you have any advice about what should we do when we graduate? And there are lots of people who do Japanese literature because they love Japanese literature, and then they get their degree and then they start questioning what do they do with it, because there aren't that many opportunities really, or at least it's not the most obvious career path to take. So do you have any advice on that?
Right. Yeah. Well, if you go on to graduate school, for example, if you get a master's or you continue on, either here in Japan or abroad, in Japanese literature, one obvious direction to go to would be as an academic in Japanese literature, either here or abroad. When I first came to Japan to study and ended up settling here, we didn't have the internet. Digitization of the whole sort of corpus of Japanese literature was really just beginning. So it was really, it was like a crucial decision to decide whether you were going to actually physically be here all the time, to be able to go through different archives and travel around the country and look at old books, or do a different kind of research abroad using basically, sort of modern editions like this of books, which are all, edited properly and so forth. So, and translate perhaps as well. So that was like a very, very stark decision that people in my generation had to make. But I think people who are coming up in college now, or have just graduated, perhaps in graduate school, or thinking about, going back to graduate school, perhaps, are in a very, very different environment. You don't necessarily need to be physically located here in Japan in order to do really, really original good work in Japanese, using Japanese language and the things that you've learned, for example, studying Japanese history or Japanese religion or Japanese art or Japanese literature, in the humanities, in other words. But on the other hand, Japanese society itself and Japanese academia certainly still really put high value on being sort of rigorous about being able to really know the facts of what you're doing in your field, whether you're an art historian or a religion history person or a literary historian like myself. Um, Having a theoretical background and a framework in order to analyze and to share what you know and what you have to say with the rest of the world in other areas is very important. But especially because it's Japanese literature and everybody here most people are Japanese readers. It's very important that you have a very deep knowledge and can work in the text themselves originally and not have to constantly be looking at translations and so forth. So I think, first of all, it's important to be able to get yourself to a point where you can actually swim around and actually travel whatever period or whatever work or whatever sphere or discourse that you're working in by yourself. Okay, I think that's the goal. Whether you're writing your graduation thesis or you're writing your master's thesis or you're working on your doctoral thesis, I think it's really important that you have your own sort of base and you're able to sort of to read and to see and to work with those materials and to describe to other people what's important about it. Having said that, you don't need to be an academic. You don't have to spend your life in a university to use that as valuable sort of resource for your life and to enrich yourself and to enrich the people around you. Certainly, a lot of translators, people who are working in companies or are independent themselves as translators here in Japan or all over the world, are really doing really good, important work. And the best ones are really strong Japanese readers. And they also are really very good at writing in the language, writing or expressing themselves in the language that they're translating into as well, okay? Also, another thing, now we're sort of, ICT, IT is so important to everyone now, and it's changed so many of the paradigms and the choices that we have, or given us new restrictions, or out, we're, sort of confined by the algorithms that surround us and that we use every day. One thing that I notice as someone who's a so-called sort of public intellectual in Japan, who's involved in all kinds of different media, is that a lot of creators, for example, visual, video, game creators, video creators, people who are interested in social design, for example, have really high standards and are really good at what they do, but they don't have original content. And we often don't have access to the incredibly rich sort of heritage or the legacy of what was actually going on here 150 or 120 years ago. One of a program that I set up at the National Institute of Japanese Literature 4 years ago was what we call a sort of initiative in the Japanese arts. And we invited artists, writers, novelists, animation artists, painters, to come and to reside in the Institute and use the materials that we have together with professionals in the field. In other words, to have workshops with Japanese literary scholars and a playwright and a novelist or a painter in order to give them access, to allow them to have access into something that was going on here, something that was written or drawn 300 years ago, which they wouldn't be able to dive into just by themselves. So we need to create that interface more. From our point of view, from the professional literary historian's point of view, we need to be able to open up the incredibly rich legacy of Japanese classical literature and art more to people who are thinking about what they want to do and how to use that in their own careers. That's one aspect, but on the other hand, as I said, if you're, for example, if you're interested in creating video content, if you're interested in being a game designer, you're interested in social design, interested in sort of lowering the barriers that actually exist in physical infrastructure, in spaces, in people and stuff like that. One thing that's really, really important is to know what's going on locally and to have a sort of historical grounding or sense, or to be able to go into historical experience, just like 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, to find resources that aren't being used now, but are still really, really valid. And there are a lot of resources. I know that from my own experiences in Japanese literature that nobody uses. Okay, they're just dormant. They're just sort of there. So, anyway, I'm going on this diatribe about what you can do having gotten a degree in Japanese literature, other than being a scholar. I think there are dozens and dozens of ways that you can retool yourself or use the work or the experience that you've had in reading older Japanese literature to create new value. As well. And that's something that I really want to encourage people to think about and to scratch the surface and to look into.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that we all learned something from this speech, and I do totally agree that you can sort of mix different spheres, and especially different creative people. They can collaborate and they have so many things to learn from each other. And that brings us to my next question, which is how to meet these kind of people in Japan. You've mentioned that workshop that you have, which I think is a wonderful possibility for many people to exchange ideas. But do you know of any other ways to just find people like that and have that kind of cultural exchange?
Right. Well, Alex, for one thing, this is true of myself, as a citizen living and working here in Japan. We have SNS now. So there's so many different ways of finding out what's going on. Venues where, if you're interested in poetry, there are poetry readings going all over the place. If you're interested in photography, there are like art photography or journalistic photography workshops going on that are actually, going on right now as we speak. That have very, very low, sort of hurdles and barriers to get into, and communities, online communities that are accessible. Not all of them are accessible if you're coming from out of the language. This is true in Korea or China or other languages as well. You need to be able to have a certain amount of literacy, or to be able to at least, search what you're looking for in the language itself, perhaps. But there are lots of ways of gaining access, first of all, not to individual people, but to activities and to organizations or to loose groups of people who are doing things or struggling or trying to figure out where to go, sort of in a way that sort of maybe echoes with your own situation right now. And I really want to encourage people to look into and knock on doors that are digitally being set up and produced here in Japan or in Japanese from all over the place. One thing that's really, really great, it's like from the beginning of this year, for example, Clubhouse was like really, really big at the beginning of this year, and a lot of people still use it. I have an account and I do a Clubhouse room every Sunday night at 9 o'clock about the Ginza. There's a neighborhood there's an area in Tokyo which is called Ginza. It's very, very famous, and I'm writing a literary history of that part of the town. I've been working on it for years and years and years, but I have friends who have small shops, small sweet shops and bars, and people who are doing all kinds of really, really interesting things in Ginza. And we get together for 1 hour on Sunday night at 9 o'clock. We just talk about what's going on in Ginza, the history of it. And it's just so free. Everybody just sort of comes in. I'm one of the moderators. A lot of people in Japan know me and know who I am. And if you just raise your hand as a listener at Clubhouse, one of the moderators, there are two of us, will just raise you up and you can just start a conversation. And that's something that was like unimaginable just like 2 or 3 years ago. And there's so many different ways of doing that, not just, Clubhouse, but just other kinds, Twitter, Space, all kinds of other sort of ways that you can actually sort of get in touch with people who are doing things or on the cutting edge or stumbling onto some kind of edge of what you're interested in doing as well. So that's really exciting to me, and it's underutilized. There are not enough people. There's not enough sort of going back and forth between English languages or other languages and what's going on in Japanese here as well. So I would like to encourage people to do that. People are really, I find, I don't know, what do you think, Alex? I find people really, people who have, sort of made their own sort of worlds for themselves in whatever area it is in Japan, I find are generally pretty accessible. I mean, everybody's really busy, but
Yes, that's the problem.
but I think people generally, especially people who are coming up, younger people are really, this was true to me, for me, people are really happy to show people along and to open doors and to connect people together. I think that's, I don't know if it's a cultural advantage that we have in Japan, but it's certainly, I think that there are a lot of people who are really actually very eager to help people out. So yeah, get up your
I
courage.
think, it sounds amazing. Actually, I'd love to join your clubhouse events.
Right.
Maybe tomorrow or
Okay, yeah, we're
sometime
talking
soon.
today. We're taping on Saturday, so tomorrow night, if you're interested, join, and I will look for you as well.
Okay, okay.
Please come together. It's really interesting. Really famous kabuki actors, singers, actresses, all kinds of people just sort of wander in and wander out. It's really a strange room that we've got, and then just people who are like work in Ginza, physical trainers, all kinds of really interesting people. And we're making a map of Ginza. Every day after the clubhouse finishes by 9 o'clock in the morning the next day, every shop or every sort of spot that we talked about gets pinned onto a Google map. And we're creating this sort of virtual sort of map where you can actually, and there's an app that goes with it. And we've created this little key holder as well that has a QR code on it that you can just, if you're walking around Ginza, you can open up the map and you can see everything. There are like 300 spots on it already with sort of explanations about all of these different, really interesting, deep Ginza, fascinating sort of, art galleries and bars and shops and places like that as well. Anyway, enough advertisement for
anyway, I'm sure that everyone is invited if you are able to join. Yes, and I'm also thinking that maybe some of our audience would have a question. Is it happening in Japanese? And if so, what level of Japanese do you need to have to start communicating with people like that? Because if you don't speak any Japanese, I would assume that is not, it's quite tough, isn't it, to communicate?
Yeah, I think, Alex, I think we both remember, I'm not sure of your background or when you started learning Japanese, but I know for myself that I went through these, it felt to me like going through a series of doors. I don't know if you have dreams like this, but sometimes I have sort of dreams where they're like, there's a door waiting on the other side of the door and you just sort of open and you go back sometimes. But anyway, it felt like I was going through this endless sort of process of going one step further and further towards a way of communicating what I felt to people so that the conversation wasn't constantly stopping. To me, it was the people that surrounded me when I was an elementary Japanese learner were really encouraging. I mean, I started out in an American university elementary Japanese intensive course over the summer. So the people around me who spoke Japanese were professionals. They were instructors. So of course they were encouraging. But the first time that I came to study in Japan when I was 19 or 20, people around me were really, you go into a coffee shop or a bar, or you'd be standing online for something, and you just sort of start up a conversation. And people in Japan tend to flatter your Japanese, even if it's not good. So, but that's good. That's a way to break the ice. People tend to be shy here as in other places. What's really important is to just step out and to just start, sort of speaking to people and not and not feel pressured, and not feel that you have to learn and be able to do everything right on the mark, do everything perfectly within a certain period of time. Learning a foreign language is like learning a musical instrument or training for a sport. You have to drill constantly. You have to just complete. It's very, very repetitive. It's very physical. It's a very physical thing. You have to just constantly be, sort of using it yourself. It's not something that I think it's more physical than mental in a way. So just put yourself in a position before the screen or in Japan or among a community of Japanese speakers where you're actually using it, even if you're only at the elementary level. I think that's really, really important.
Yes, well, I think we have reached the main message of today's interview. That is, learn Japanese, put yourself out there, and so try to not only speak but read Japanese. And yes, thank you so much for coming today. I am sure that was a very valuable talk. At least the parts that you said were very valuable to our listeners. And personally, I also really enjoyed listening to you, and I've learned a lot. And my last thing that I'd like to ask you for is whether you could maybe recite a poem for us. That would be the grand finale of today's conversation.
A poem that I create out of my head right now, or something, a Japanese poem that I like.
Favorite Japanese poem would be good.
Oh, okay. All right. There's a book right here which is actually it's translations of Japanese lyrics, which I wrote and published a couple of years ago, and I've just been looking over because I'm writing something else about it. There's a Japanese singer who I believe is a great poet as well. He's active. His name is Inoue Yosui. And he's a really, really good singer. He's in his early 70s right now. I think he was a singer-songwriter from the folk rock movement in the 1970s and 1980s, and he's continued to put out a lot of hits in Japan. And this is the book right here. It's called Inoue Yosui Eiyaku Shishu, an anthology of English translations of Inoue Yosui's lyrics. And I translated them. I translated 50 of his songs about 10 years ago because I fell ill and I was in the hospital for a month, and I was really in really, really bad shape for a while. But as I came out and I realized that I was going to survive my ailment, I had almost a month ahead of me. So I just decided that every day I would translate one poem a day to sort of to spend the time and to make myself sort of relax and return myself, sort of to my sense, and to relax, and also to heal myself in a sense. So I started translating his lyrics, and I got addicted to it, and I ended up with 50 of his poems, which I then wrote a long essay about and published a couple of years ago. Anyway, let me see what I'm going to read to you in English. You want this in English, right? I suppose.
You can read both in Japanese and in English if you
okay.
like to do so.
You can edit this and decide. Maybe just the Japanese. Maybe you may decide that the English is not good enough. Anyway, since this is at the end of this very, very pleasant, enlightening for me interview, I want to read something that he wrote a long time ago. It's a song called Musubi Kotoba, which I've translated as words toward the end. It might be good for us to end our conversation today. Let me read it in Japanese first then, okay? Musubi Kotoba. Asaki yume, awaki koi, toki michi, aoki sora. 今日駆け巡るも立ち止まるも青き空の下の出来事。迷い雲白き夏。一人旅長き冬。春を思い出すも忘れるも遠き道の途中でのこと。浅き夢、淡き恋。遠き道、青き空。I've translated it like this. Words toward the end. Shallow dreams, blurred love, roads far away, a blue sky, Whether we run about today or stay put, all this happens under a blue, blue sky. Clouds adrift, summer white, a long voyage, long winter. Whether we recall spring or forget it, all this happens halfway down a long, long road. Shallow dreams, blurred love, roads far away, a blue sky.
Wow.
Sorry, that's one of his words. It's a very sort of like lyrical, simple song, but I like the tone of it, and it sounded good to read at the end of a conversation.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for reading your translation. It was great to have you. We hope to maybe have this conversation again sometime.
Yeah, thank you,
so
Alex.
Much.
That was great. You're a great navigator, and I was really, really happy to hear some of your own experiences and your opinions and your thoughts as well. And I look forward to being on the other side of the monitor someday and asking you some questions about what you're doing in further depth at some other time. Okay. Anyway, take care of yourself, and
thank you.
Hope everybody has a
Thank you for watching us today. Yes. Thank you for your time. Bye bye.
Good. Bye bye.